Nightlight through slatted blinds. A man sits on the edge of a couch, shirt untucked, one knee propped, phone face down on the coffee table, like a bomb he dares not touch. He has rehearsed lines until they sound like armor. He has curated friend lists until his social proof reads as a resume. He has polished a version of himself. He wears to dinner and wears to bed, and yet nothing feels real because his value floats on the tide of another as attention. He scrolls messages again because certainty is an addiction, and silence is the most poisonous thing he knows. He tries to charm with over-scrutinized generosity, not because he feels it, but because he has calculated it. He tries to solve problems that were never his to solve, so she will think of him as necessary. He confuses presence for possession and proximity for power. He sacrifices boundaries for brief glimpses of approval. He speaks louder with accomplishments to drown out his doubts. He laughs too hard at jokes he has heard 100 times because he fears that to breathe without laughter is to reveal the lack beneath. He leans forward when he should stand steady. He anticipates moves like a poor chess player trying to forestall an inevitable checkmate by moving pawns at random. He bargains with himself in the dark, promising a harder version the next morning, and the next morning repeats the same small mistakes. The failed action is not a grand catastrophe. It is 1,000 small urgencies played out across messages and microacts until the cumulative effect is deflation. The crushing consequence arrives slow and inexorable. She is not irritated by what he does. She is bored. She is not moved by gifts. She is unmoved by performance. She senses the underlying hunger and meets it with hesitation because hunger is not attractive. She becomes free of him. She practices absence until his name becomes an echo in rooms he does not occupy. He is left with the knowledge that wanting is cheap and losing is costly. If this is the tax the world charges for desire, then he has been bankrupt for a long time. This is the reversal we must understand. The axis of relational gravity is not how much longing one can manufacture. The real axis is the cost of loss. People hold on when loss is unbearable. People commit when the future without you is framed as a worse world. This is not cruelty. It is structural truth. It is a law as old as cities. We will borrow from a blunt school of political intelligence. We will turn a strategist's S-lens inward and examine intimate currency not as a betrayal of desire, but as a method for preserving dignity. The lessons come from a thinker who taught that power is preserved by perception, and that kings are remembered by their capacity to make allies and enemies understand the cost of losing them. We will translate that political clarity into the architecture of attraction and attachment. The promise of this manifesto is a deliberate conversion from reaction into strategy, from pleading to containment, from a posture of lack to one of calibrated abundance. The thesis is direct and non-negotiable. Stop trying to make her want you. Make her afraid to lose you instead. Understand the single instrument we are borrowing. Power in intimate life is not administered like a kindness. It is administered like a currency that must be conserved. The thinker we invoke, Niccolò Machiavelli, taught that rulers who mistake affection for allegiance will be surprised first by withdrawal and then by betrayal. He argued that the stable sovereign structures incentives so that loss is a calamity and absence is an unbearable cost. Translate that into relationship language, and you have a concept that is stark and operational. Imagine a harbor. Ships come and go. A harbor that provides shelter and meaning will see ships return. A harbor that begs for arrival will be empty. A harbor that gives and remains unmoored will be forgotten. You want to be the lighthouse and the cliff combined. You want to be necessary because you are valuable and ordered, not because you chase arrivals one by one. That is the essence of the concept we borrow from political craft. The geometry is simple. There are 3 vectors that determine whether a person stays: emotional resonance, perceived scarcity, and the cost of loss. Emotional resonance is the magnet. Perceived scarcity creates urgency. The cost of loss raises the stakes until commitment becomes the rational choice. Neglect any vector, and you reduce the force field that binds another person to you. Too much resonance without scarcity leads to complacency. Too much scarcity without resonance suggests indifference. Too little cost of loss results in replaceability. There is also timing. Fortune must be read and sometimes compelled. Competence is not vanity. It is practiced capability. Learn to steady your face when gossip arrives. Learn to speak with the cadence of someone who has solved problems through storm and winter. That steadiness is a signal. It broadcasts that your presence stabilizes and that removing you exacts a price. Historically, the arc was not elegant. The instruction favored pragmatic remedies over platitudes. The essential lesson for intimate life is the same. Cultivate practical habits that signal capacity rather than narrate it. Build competence so that perception follows reality. Manage your reputation not through announcements, but through quiet results. This is the virtue of results over rhetoric, and it is the spindle on which relational gravity turns. How does one apply this without becoming a caricature? First, build reserves so your resonance is authentic and not performative. Master your moods and refuse to outsource your validation. Second, practice scarcity as disciplined allocation of presence. Protect your time and be unavailable to trivial demands. Third, raise the cost of leaving by creating woven value. Invest in experiences, social capital, and an identity that is not easily replicated. Make your partnership an enhancement of life, not a utility. These are not tricks. They are an architecture of consequence. The political instruction was pragmatic calculation. In our context, it is the architecture of durable attraction and attachment. We will not romanticize scarcity into cruelty. We will not convert value into calculation devoid of tenderness. We ask instead for a sober recalibration of self so that absence is felt as loss, because presence is real and generative. Now move from concept to test. If you vanish tomorrow, who would notice first and why? The answer is not a test. It is a diagnostic. It reveals the holes you must mend and the truths you must accept before you can engineer something durable. We begin with diagnosis. Male psychology in the contemporary architecture of romance carries an identity problem. Men are taught to perform competence and hide need. That contradiction produces a ghost of behavior. Performative potency masks a core of insecurity. He is anxious about being replaceable because social markets are louder than they once were. Attention is a commodity, and the noise of possible auctions creates a chronic fear of obsolescence. The common response is urgency disguised as earnest interest. He texts too soon. He offers to fix things that were never his to fix. He over-explains feelings as if explanation were currency. He escalates promises and then finds himself unable to fulfill them because he built his promises out of desire and not capacity. The collapse is slow. Loyalty evaporates. Respect wanes. Attraction turns into pity. This is predictable, and it is salvageable only when he stops assuming that making someone want him is the same as being the kind of man who deserves long-term regard. Female psychology is not a monolith, but certain patterning is reliable. Women track signals of organization and social capital. They pay attention to how a person arranges his life, whom he trusts, how he responds under pressure, and whether his absence produces chaos or calm. They encode scarcity and cost differently. Scarcity can be attractive when it signals selectivity. Cost is the calculation the mind runs when imagining futures. Does losing this person mean losing an anchor, or merely trading for something novel? Novelty seduces. Cost secures. Why does fear hold better than desire in many cases? Because fear is an arithmetic that calcifies. Desire waxes and wanes with mood and novelty. Fear imposes clearer incentives. When the cost of loss rises above the allure of transient novelty, The rational move becomes long-term investment. That is why the political strategist prized fear when love could not be ensured. It is not a moral preference. It is a statement about durability. How do you take this knowledge and make it ethical rather than manipulative? The first step is self-work. The second step is structural engineering of your life. Self-work means becoming a person whose presence already increases in others' well-being. Structural engineering means cultivating marketplace signals that are hard to counterfeit. Both are necessary, and neither is about coercion. Both are about becoming a man who would be a true diminution to another life if he left. Begin by stopping 3 behaviors that leak value. Stop the immediate apologetic. Stop the substituted activity where you busyness yourself into appearing valuable. Stop the public rewriting of your boundaries to chase uncertain affection. These behaviors reduce perceived capability because they expose dependence. Cutting them is painful and clarifying quickly. Adopt 3 practices instead. First, practice steady competence. Show up to the commitments you actually make. Deliver on the small things. A man who is reliable in small domains becomes credible in larger ones. Second, practice selective presence. Do not broadcast availability like a shop with an open sign lit 24 hours a day. Value time by gating it. Third, practice woven value. Invest in shared rituals, memorable experiences, social circles, and skills that are difficult to replicate. Those create networks of meaning. These are concrete calibrations. They are not theatrical games. They change perception not by deception, but by making your life richer and your offerings rarer. The trick is not trickery. The trick is becoming someone worth keeping. Elaborate the communication patterns. Learn the difference between explaining and declaring. Explanations can feel like pleading. Declarations are steadier. When you state a boundary with calm conviction, you do 2 things. You model your internal economy, and you force the other person to make a choice under clear conditions. That choice is the crucible where fear of loss becomes rational. Tune your timing. When you withdraw, do so with dignity and not fury. Withdrawal must be consistent and principled so that absence becomes a predictable consequence of disrespect rather than random cruelty. Is this manipulation? Sometimes if used to coerce. It ceases to be manipulation when it is rooted in integrity and accompanied by genuine care for the other. Sovereignty practiced well is service. Power rightly used protects both parties from erosion and invites the other person to either rise to meet the value you offer or to leave with eyes open. Now move into escalating applications. Imagine 2 men with equal charm. One is present and hungry. The other is present and composed. The first floods the inbox with sentiments that beg verification. The second cultivates a life outside the relationship with people he loves and projects an availability that is limited and deliberate. Which of them is harder to replace? The second. The story is not cruelty. It is comparative economics. When 2 options stand side by side, the brain picks the asset that feels more generative. Build social capital outward. A man who is surrounded by trusted friends, colleagues, and activities carries an aura that says his life is flourishing without being defensive about it. That aura is not vanity. It is a buffer. It tells the mind of a potential partner that losing him would subtract more than minutes from a calendar. It would reduce networks and experiences and meaning. You raise the cost of leaving not by withholding affection, but by adding positive externalities to your life. Ritualize value. Create recurring experiences that are uniquely yours and that include the other person when it matters. A Friday ritual with its own language. A corner table that becomes part of your story. Shared projects that require both participation and skill. These are harder to replicate than personality flattery. They become woven into memory and resistant to exchange. Master public perception. Reputation is not spin when it is earned. Be the man people speak of as generous, competent, and steady. Reputation amplifies scarcity, because it proves that multiple lives orient around you. You do not have to announce it. You simply live so that your absence creates ripples in the lives around you. Now consider attachment patterns. If you are dealing with someone who is avoidant, the wrong move is to chase and demand. Withdraw with clarity and show stability by being consistent in your calm. If you are dealing with someone who is anxious, the wrong move is to feed the anxiety with over-engagement. Instead, show steady competence in small rituals so their models of safety are rewritten slowly. In both cases, consistency wins over dramatic gestures. What about conflict? Use conflict to show you do not evaporate under pressure. Solve problems instead of shaming. If you need to withdraw, use it as a method of recalibration, not revenge. The moment you weaponize absence, you reduce trust and you transform scarcity into unpredictability, which is corrosive rather than magnetic. Here are concrete daily practices. Wake with a plan that is not anchored to another person's responses. Carry 3 non-negotiable tasks that you complete regardless. Keep 1 full day a week for social expansion and 1 night a week for solitude. When invited to respond instantly to messages, delay enough to preserve dignity, but not to punish. Speak the truth plainly and briefly when boundaries are crossed. Invest in a skill that rewires your identity through repeated competency and displays a trajectory of growth. Push further and make scarcity moral rather than theatrical. You are not acting. You are choosing to defend the life you want to lead. Become someone whose absence subtracts meaning. That will repel convenience seekers and magnetize serious partners. The practice is daily and small, but cumulative. Courage is required to say no when saying yes would cost your dignity. Courage is required to cultivate a life that orbits your own purpose rather than external validation. When you do this, you create an existence that naturally produces the cost of loss the world will notice. Push further. Make scarcity moral rather than theatrical. You are not playing a role. You are choosing to defend the life you want to lead. When you become someone who is intentionally hard to replace, you also cultivate better choices around you. People who need you for convenience will leave. People who need you for depth will stay and invest. That is the signal you want. Everyday courage remains the fulcrum. It is courage to say no when you are tempted to say yes for the sake of approval. It is courage to assemble a life that does not orbit external validation. It is courage to ask the question that returns you to yourself and not to dependency. The biographical thread matters because ideas are forged in life and blood. Consider the observer who watched republics and princes and distilled what worked into blunt counsel. He was not sentimental about virtue. He was obsessed with survival and perception because his world demanded it. Take that lesson without the cynicism. Understand that clear-eyed realism about incentives and consequence need not erase tenderness. It should simply reframe tenderness so that tenderness is an element of strength and not an invitation to be catalogued and discarded. The man who studies power learns to use honesty as armor and discipline as a method of devotion. Now the final edict. This is not a recipe for cruelty. It is a rule for endurance. Decide now whether your life will be governed by immediate appetite or by calibrated sovereignty. Choose to become a man whose inner worth is not a function of someone else passing judgment. Choose to make scarcity a moral act rather than a petty trick. Choose to engineer woven value instead of transactional flattery. Choose steadiness over spectacle and presence over panic. Choose to be the man whose absence is a wound that reshapes choices rather than a trivial vacancy. You will be tempted to mistake theatrics for mastery. You will be tempted to test people and to justify it as measurement. Resist those cheap impulses. Tests become traps when they are designed to provoke rather than reveal. The real test is not what someone will do under provocation. The real test is whether your life is arranged so that leaving you would be a cost and not a convenience. That is the endgame of power in intimacy. It is quiet and dangerous, and it operates below most people's attention. How will you start? Begin with a small inventory. List 5 things you do out of desperation for approval. Erase 2 immediately. Then list 5 non-negotiable competencies you will develop over the next 90 days. Begin building rituals and a social architecture that supports them. Wait each morning to these tasks and let them root in your habit. Make promises sparingly. Start with a calendar audit today. Block 3 hours this week for skill work and 2 evenings for the friends and projects that fuel your sense of worth. Remove one social commitment that drains rather than builds. Say no to one superficially flattering invitation this month and keep the boundaries you announce. Measure results not by immediate reciprocation, but by whether your life accrues more meaningful friction and fewer frantic concessions. Track these changes for 90 days and let your small rituals compound into an identity. The final choice is an identity question. Will you be the man who chases or the man who magnetizes? Will you be afraid of abandonment, or will you become the kind of person whose loss is costly because your presence improves the world? Power does not require cruelty. It requires courage, discipline, strategy, and a careful heart. Be fierce in your standards and tender in your stewardship. Hold the paradox and refine it until it becomes your signature. You have heard a doctrine that borrows from blunt political craft and translates it into intimate architecture. That doctrine will fail if you use it as raw technique detached from moral tether. It will succeed if you integrate it into a life of competence craft and compassion. Understand that this is a lifelong practice. The aim is not to manufacture fear, but to embody values so unmistakable that loss feels consequential. Walk this path with care. Build a life that holds you even when others do not. Begin now and be relentless.